For decades, Judge Greg Mathis stood on national television as a symbol of redemption, discipline, and moral authority. He lectured strangers about responsibility, loyalty, and consequences, often reminding them that family was everything. But in the summer of 2024, something happened that quietly shattered the image he had spent 40 years building. When his wife Linda Mathis filed for divorce, it wasn't just paperwork. It was the moment the private cracks finally surfaced. And the truth behind what unfolded in those weeks was far more painful than anyone expected. The image that never cracked. For most of America, Judge Greg Mathis did not just represent the law, he represented transformation. His story was repeated so often it became almost sacred. A boy from Detroit's Herman Gardens, surrounded by violence, drugs, and desperation, who fell into crime, survived prison, and somehow rebuilt his life from the inside out. That story wasn't just inspirational. It became the foundation of his authority. Every lecture he delivered on television carried the weight of lived experience. Every harsh word was softened by the reminder that he himself had once stood on the other side of the bench. But behind that public narrative was another story running quietly for decades: his marriage to Linda Reese Mathis. They married in June of 1985, long before fame, before the court show, before the Walk of Fame star. Linda was there when Greg was still struggling to be taken seriously, still fighting a system that remembered his past more clearly than his progress. While he worked 15-hour days, 5 and sometimes 6 days a week, she held the family together. 4 children followed, a home that looked stable, a partnership that appeared unbreakable. Greg said it himself on their reality series years later. He called his family his greatest achievement. He credited Linda as the reason he was able to work the hours he did, chase opportunity, and survive pressure. Together, they presented an image that felt almost deliberate in its perfection. No public fighting, no scandals, no tabloid chaos. Even in early 2024, months before everything fell apart, they stood side by side at public events, insisting they were a wholesome family with shared values and mutual respect. That image mattered, especially to Greg. His authority came not just from the law, but from the idea that he lived what he preached. Family first. Loyalty matters. Accountability at home, not just in the courtroom. And for nearly 4 decades, no one had reason to seriously question it. But images can survive pressure longer than truth can. And by the summer of 2024, the distance between what the public saw and what was happening behind closed doors had become impossible to ignore. The separation did not begin with shouting or headlines. It began quietly, with emotional absence, unresolved resentment, and years of imbalance that had never been fully addressed. By the time Linda listed their separation date as mid-July, the marriage was already breaking in ways the cameras had never captured. What followed, the divorce filing, the rumors, the emotional collapse, and the eventual reconciliation, did not come from nowhere. It came from years of silence finally reaching its limit. And once that silence broke, everything changed. The summer. Everything slipped. By the time the summer of 2024 arrived, the marriage between Greg and Linda Mathis was already living on borrowed time. Nothing dramatic had exploded in public. There were no screaming matches caught on camera, no sudden disappearances, no emergency press statements. What existed instead was something quieter and far more dangerous: emotional distance that had stretched on for years without resolution. Linda later admitted that the problem wasn't a single betrayal or a single argument. It was the slow realization that she had been supporting everyone else for decades while quietly losing herself in the process. On July 17, 2024, Linda marked the date of separation. That detail would later appear plainly in court documents, but at the time, it reflected something deeply personal. She chose space, Not revenge, not spectacle, just distance. For nearly 40 years, her role had been stability, managing the household, overseeing finances, protecting the family image while Greg carried the weight of public life. But by mid-2024, that balance had collapsed. Emotional neglect, unresolved resentment, and the strain of living beside a man constantly consumed by work and reputation had reached a breaking point. 5 weeks later, on August 22nd, Linda filed for divorce. The reason listed was simple and painfully common: irreconcilable differences. But behind those words sat years of silence, disappointment, and emotional exhaustion. She sought spousal support, while also requesting that her own obligation to provide support be waived, a legal detail that quietly underscored how uneven the marriage had become. This was not a power play. It was a line drawn for self-preservation. For Greg, the filing landed like a delayed explosion. He had survived prison, public scrutiny, and decades of judgment from strangers. But this was different. This was home. The marriage had been his emotional anchor, the proof that redemption had stuck. Losing it forced him to confront something he had avoided for years. Success had not protected him from neglecting the person who stood beside him before the world ever listened. The headlines focused on shock. The truth was far heavier. This wasn't a sudden ending. It was the moment a long, quiet unraveling finally became visible. 3 weeks that broke him. The 3 weeks after the divorce filing were not loud. They were heavy in a way that settled into the body and refused to leave. For Greg Mathis, the separation did not feel like a legal process unfolding on paper. It felt like a personal collapse happening in slow motion, hour by hour. This was a man who had spent decades controlling courtrooms, commanding respect, and lecturing others about accountability. Yet suddenly, he had no authority over the one place that mattered most: his own home. The routines that once gave his life structure dissolved overnight, leaving him alone with thoughts he had spent years avoiding. As news of the filing spread, the public response came fast and unforgiving. Social media did what it always does. It filled silence with speculation. Rumors surfaced about affairs, about emotional neglect, about a secret child that tabloids rushed to turn into fact before evidence ever had a chance to exist. None of it was proven, but that hardly mattered. The narrative was already forming, and Greg could feel it slipping beyond his control. For someone whose entire career depended on credibility and moral authority, the damage was not just emotional. It was existential. The question wasn't whether the rumors were true. It was whether people still believed in the man behind the robe. Privately, Greg was unraveling. He later admitted that the pain of those weeks felt identical to the grief he experienced when his mother died. That comparison was not dramatic language chosen for sympathy. It was a confession. His mother had been the first person who forced him to choose a different life, the one who stood between him and a future that could have ended in prison or death. Losing Linda felt like losing that anchor all over again, the one person who had seen him before fame, before television, before applause, and stayed through every transformation. While the internet debated his morality, Greg was facing something far more uncomfortable: self-awareness. He was forced to confront how many years he had prioritized work, image, and responsibility to strangers over emotional presence at home. 15-hour days had once been survival. Over time, they became routine, then justification, then distance. The very discipline that built his career slowly hollowed out his marriage. Linda had not left suddenly. She had waited, endured, and hoped for change long after hope had started to cost her peace. Eventually, staying felt more damaging than walking away. During those weeks, therapy became unavoidable. Conversations that had been postponed for years were finally spoken out loud. the imbalance of emotional labor, the loneliness of being married to a man who was physically present but emotionally elsewhere, the resentment that had been buried under routine, faith, and reputation. For the first time, Greg was not the judge in the room. He was not delivering verdicts or life lessons. He was simply a husband, listening to consequences without a script, without applause, and without control. By the end of those 3 weeks, something shifted. Not because the pain disappeared, but because it became impossible to deny. Greg realized that losing his marriage would not just change his personal life. It would dismantle the very foundation of the image he had spent decades defending. The redemption story he told others meant nothing if it failed in the place where it mattered most, and for the first time in his life, he understood that winning in court meant nothing if he lost at home. The confession that changed everything. Reconciliation did not begin with forgiveness. It began with honesty that was long overdue. When Greg Mathis later admitted that he would have done anything to get his wife back, it was not a polished television soundbite. It was the result of weeks spent confronting the parts of himself he had ignored for years. Therapy stripped away the roles he was used to playing, the judge, the public figure, the moral authority, and left him exposed as a husband who had failed to show up emotionally. Linda's decision to file for divorce had never been about punishment. It was about survival. After nearly 4 decades of supporting Greg's rise, managing the family and protecting their image, she reached a moment where continuing to give without receiving felt unbearable. In therapy, she made something clear. The deeper wound was not betrayal alone, but absence. Emotional neglect had accumulated slowly, quietly, until it became impossible to dismiss. For Greg, hearing that truth was devastating. He admitted publicly that an affair had occurred, a confession that contradicted the image he had built over decades. But even that admission did not fully explain the damage. Linda later confirmed that while the affair hurt, the real fracture came from years of distance, routine, and unspoken resentment. Fame had not created the problem, it had simply masked it. The work that followed was not fast or performative, it was uncomfortable. They relearned each other. Daily conversations replaced assumptions, boundaries were redrawn. Linda chose herself without abandoning the marriage. Greg chose accountability without defensiveness. For the first time, reconciliation was not about preserving an image. It was about rebuilding trust from the ground up. By the time they quietly called off the divorce, the decision surprised many but felt inevitable to them. The marriage did not return to what it was. It became something new, scarred, humbled, and more honest than before. The legal separation lasted only 3 weeks, but the emotional reckoning stretched far beyond that. What saved the marriage was not history, reputation, or fear of public judgment. It was the recognition that love without presence eventually collapses, no matter how strong the foundation once seemed. Facing the world after the silence broke. When Greg and Linda Mathis finally appeared together again, the hardest part was not facing the public. It was admitting that the public had never known the full truth. For years, their marriage had been held up as proof that redemption could last forever if discipline was strong enough. Now, that illusion was gone. What replaced it was something far less comfortable: vulnerability. On the Tamron Hall show, Greg did not try to minimize what happened. He spoke slowly, carefully, as if every word carried weight. He described the 3-week separation as devastating, comparing the pain to the grief he felt when his mother died. That comparison stunned many viewers, but for Greg it was the only language that fit. His mother had once been the reason he escaped prison and chose a different life. Losing Linda felt like losing the person who had held that transformation together. Linda's words were quieter, but no less powerful. She explained that filing for divorce was not an act of anger. It was an act of self-preservation. After decades of supporting Greg's career and carrying the emotional weight of the family, she reached a moment where she needed to choose herself. The reconciliation, she said, did not happen because time passed. It happened because real work was done, daily, deliberately, without shortcuts. Their children watched everything unfold under a microscope. What could have fractured the family instead became a moment of alignment. They supported the reconciliation, not because it was easy, but because it was honest. Greg Jr. later admitted the media attention was overwhelming, unlike anything the family had faced before. Still, relief followed, not because the marriage returned to what it once was, but because it survived truth. For Greg, the experience changed how he spoke about responsibility. He no longer framed morality as something enforced from a bench. He framed it as something lived at home, quietly, without applause. The reconciliation did not erase the damage. It acknowledged it, and that acknowledgement became the most credible lesson he had ever offered. In the end, the marriage did not survive because of fame, faith, or fear of scandal. It survived because both people accepted that redemption is not a destination. It is a daily decision, one that can still fail if neglected long enough. So what do you think really broke the marriage? The affair, the pressure of fame, or years of emotional distance that went unspoken? Do you believe reconciliation after something like this is strength, or simply fear of loss? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if this story made you reflect on how fragile even strong relationships can be, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that go beyond the headlines.